I'm Sophia. I never really believed in endings. Not the kind that come quietly, at least. My grandfather's death didn't feel like the end of something, even though it should have. It felt more like a dislocation, like someone had shifted the ground beneath my feet and expected me to keep walking. There were no dramatic farewells or unfinished apologies. Just a voicemail from a nurse, a cold hospital corridor, and a sealed envelope I wasn't ready to open. It was early spring. When he passed, the air still carried the chill of February, but the trees had started to bud like they were trying to convince the world that warmth would return. I remember walking home from the hospital with the envelope in my coat pocket, numb fingers wrapped around a paper cup of stale coffee. I didn't cry. Not that day. My grief was slow, like water seeping through a crack in a wall. Silent, steady, and impossible to ignore once it found its way in. He had been the last of them. My mother died when I was 14, a car accident. That split my world in two and left me living with a man I barely knew. My father disappeared not long after, as if my mother had been the only thread tethering him to this life. And so my grandfather, with his quiet hands and weathered books and the smell of pipe tobacco clinging to his sweaters, became my entire family. For years, it was just the two of us in that old house with creaky floors and a garden he refused to let die, even in winter. He never said much, but he had a way of making silence feel like safety. I learned to read his moods in the way he closed a drawer or set down his tea. He never told me he loved me, but he never had to. After the funeral, which I organized, paid for, and attended almost entirely alone, I went back to the house and sat in his study. His chair still held the shape of him, and I couldn't bring myself to sit in it. Instead, I stood at the window and watched the wind press against the branches of the cherry tree he planted when I was born. I felt old and small all at once. The envelope waited for me on the desk. Thick, yellowed paper. My name in his careful, slanted handwriting. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe I thought opening it would make it real. Maybe some part of me hoped it contained something else. A secret. A message. A reason. Inside was a letter, dated a few weeks before he died. He wrote about the house, about the old books he wanted me to keep, about the garden. But the last part caught my attention. He wrote that there were things he had never told me, that there was more to our family than I knew, that after his passing, someone would contact me with information about an inheritance. He warned me to be cautious, but also said that it was something I deserved. At first, I thought he meant the house, but I already owned the house. He had signed it over to me years ago, saying he didn't want to deal with paperwork if anything happened. But this felt different. The call came a week later. It was a man who introduced himself as a legal representative. His voice was clipped and professional, but there was an ease to it, like he had delivered this kind of news before. He claimed to be working on behalf of a private estate, one that had recently rediscovered a dormant trust connected to my grandfather's name. He asked me if I had ever heard of the name Alton R. Devlin. I hadn't, but I said yes. It was a reflex. A stupid one. I just didn't want to sound ignorant or worse, ungrateful. He explained that Devlin had once been a business associate of my grandfather, and that certain financial assets had been tied up in a long-forgotten agreement between them. According to the estate, these assets were now legally mine. It sounded absurd, like a fairy tale someone forgot to finish. I remember sitting in my kitchen, phone to my ear, a forkful of microwaved pasta halfway to my mouth. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, even though he couldn't see me. He offered to send over the documents. I agreed. He said I would need to verify my identity, sign a few forms, and that the full transfer process might take a few weeks. In the meantime, I was not to speak to anyone about it. He framed it as a precaution. Family disputes, legal complications, privacy concerns. All very standard, he said. The next day, a courier dropped off a thick packet of legal documents in a manila envelope. They looked real, too real. There were pages with watermarks, long paragraphs of legal jargon, and sticky notes with arrows pointing to where I needed to sign. My hands shook as I flipped through them. There was a page estimating the total value of the assets, $986,000. I stared at the number for a long time. I had never seen that many zeros in my life. My entire savings account barely scratched for figures. I worked at a publishing house as an assistant editor, barely scraping rent every month. The idea of having nearly $1 million made my stomach twist. I didn't believe it, but I wanted to. That night, I sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by paper, the documents, my grandfather's letter, my laptop, old photo albums. I kept looking for some kind of connection, something that would make this feel less impossible. I Googled Devlin, found nothing useful. Just a few dead links and a blurry obituary from the 80s. I signed the papers. The man had given me a prepaid envelope to mail them back. I dropped it into a blue mailbox 2 blocks from my house, feeling like I was mailing a piece of my soul. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2.no calls. No updates. Just silence. At first, I thought I had misunderstood the timeline. Legal things took time. I had watched enough courtroom dramas to know that much. But by the end of the 3rd week, a knot had formed in my chest that refused to loosen. I tried calling the number he had given me. Disconnected. I emailed the address on the paperwork. The message bounced back. I visited the address listed on the courier slip. There was no office, just an empty storefront with paper over the windows and a faded for lease sign. I stood there for a long time. Long enough for someone walking by to ask if I was okay. I wasn't. That night, I pulled everything out again. The documents, the envelope, the letter from my grandfather. I laid them all out on the kitchen table and stared at them until the words blurred. My mind circled around the same questions. Was this real? Was he part of it? Did he know? Or was he tricked too? I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went to the bank to ask about the trust. The woman behind the desk looked sympathetic but confused. There was no record of any transfer, no mention of the trust, no account under my name or my grandfather's. I left with a pamphlet about financial fraud clutched in my hand like a condolence card. It was then that the truth began to settle. I had been scammed, but not just out of hope or time or pride. I had been robbed of something much deeper, trust, and the man who did it, the one who used my grandfather's name and my grief like a key to unlock my defenses, was somewhere out there, smiling. It had been a month since I signed those documents, and every part of me still wanted to believe there had been a mistake. Maybe a clerical error, a delay in processing. Maybe the man had fallen ill, or his firm had relocated, or something equally benign and explainable. I clung to those maybes like a child clings to a nightlight. Even though I already knew the dark was real, the rational part of me had seen enough. The address was fake, the number disconnected, the email bounced, the bank knew nothing. But hope is rarely rational, and grief doesn't like to be told it was manipulated. I stopped telling people about the inheritance almost immediately. Not that I had told many to begin with. My coworkers didn't know. My few acquaintances had only heard vague mentions, but I felt the shame in my bones, the kind that burns before anyone even asks you what happened. I imagined their reactions, the polite head tilts, the forced expressions of sympathy, the quiet judgment hidden behind eyes that would never fully understand. I stopped going out. I barely showed up to work. I called in sick. Then I stopped calling altogether. No one pushed. That was the problem with being invisible. People noticed when you made noise, not when you vanished. I spent most of my days in the house, the same house my grandfather had left me. The same house I had nearly mortgaged to cover the legal verification fees and processing costs. I told myself it was a temporary investment, a small sacrifice for a life-changing gain. I had even considered quitting my job. That's how sure I had been. Now, I just wandered the halls in silence. The mornings started with a kind of dull panic. I would wake up and immediately feel the weight of it, like gravity had changed while I was sleeping. My stomach twisted before my feet even touched the floor. I didn't eat. I didn't clean. I barely moved. The days bled together, indistinguishable and cruel. I tried calling the courier company again. This time, someone answered, but they had no record of a package sent from the address I gave TFM. The tracking number I quoted wasn't even valid in their system. I asked how that was possible. The woman on the line said maybe it had been a third-party subcontractor, maybe a private delivery service, maybe a scam. Her voice was tired, like she had said those words before. I hung up and stared at the receiver for a long time. My hands didn't shake anymore. That had stopped a while ago. Now I just felt hollow, like my body was a container someone had forgotten to fill. I tried retracing my steps. I pulled up the documents again, searching for anything I might have missed. A typo, a strange phrase, an unusual formatting choice. I found none. Whoever had written them had done their homework. The language was perfect. The formatting was standard. Even the fake names had been carefully chosen. Just believable enough. I looked through my grandfather's old letters, his books, his journals, anything that might give me a clue about Devlin, or the supposed connection between them. I found nothing. He had never mentioned the man, not in words, not in passing, not even in the places where he scribbled his thoughts to himself. I began to question whether my grandfather had even written that part of the letter. His handwriting was consistent, but I kept staring at that final paragraph, trying to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, it had been added later. Maybe someone had forged it. Maybe I had missed something, but the ink was the same. The paper aged evenly. The folds matched. He had written it, which meant he had known something, or believed he had. That realization hurt more than anything else. If he had known, was he trying to help me? Or had he been deceived too? Was this a plan he had been part of? Or a trap he had accidentally left behind? There were no answers, and the not knowing ate at me like acid. Eventually, the money ran out. The savings I had been clinging to disappeared into bills and overdraft fees. The publishing house replaced me after 2 weeks of silence. I didn't blame them. I didn't even try to get the job back. I was too tired to explain. I started looking for freelance work online, small editing gigs, proofreading manuscripts for strangers who didn't care who I was or how I'd fallen apart. I stayed up late with a dim desk lamp and a growing resentment in my chest, not just toward the man who had stolen from me, but toward myself, for letting it happen, for believing, for needing it so badly. I hated that I had been so easy to fool, but more than anything, I hated how much I still wanted it to be real. I started dreaming about the money, not in extravagant ways. I didn't dream of yachts or designer clothes. I dreamed of small, quiet things, paying off the house, fixing the plumbing, buying groceries without checking my balance, sending a donation to the animal shelter where I had adopted my cat. Years ago, the dreams felt crueler than the lies. One afternoon, I sat on the floor of my grandfather's study, surrounded by paper. Again, I hadn't cleaned it in weeks. Dust clung to the bookshelves. The windows were streaked with rain from a storm I had barely noticed. I looked around and realized how much of him still lived in that room, and how little of me did. I found an old cigar box under the desk. I had seen it before, many times. He used to keep postage stamps and old coins inside. But when I opened it, I found something else. Receipts, dozens of them, folded and fading, but legible. They were all dated over a span of 2 years, all addressed to the same law firm, Devlin and Horn Associates. The name hit me like a slap. I spread the receipts across the floor, my fingers tracing the printed lines. Legal services, estate research, trust management. The charges were modest but consistent. Monthly, sometimes bi-weekly. I felt my heart start to race. If these were real, it meant my grandfather had been paying someone under that name, which meant either the scam had begun with him or he had genuinely believed in it. I searched the address on the receipts. Same building, same suite number, same street, but this time, I didn't just look it up online. I got dressed, put on real shoes for the first time in days, and left the house. The train ride was long and filled with too much noise. I had forgotten how loud the world could be. People laughed, coughed, yelled into their phones. I sat with my arms crossed, eyes locked on the window, trying not to second-guess myself. The building was in the financial district, tall, gray, and surrounded by newer, shinier structures that made it look like a relic. I stood across the street, for a while, watching people come and go. Most wore suits, all looked like they belonged. I crossed and entered the lobby. The air smelled like carpet cleaner and cheap cologne. I walked up to the receptionist, trying to sound casual when I asked if Devlin and Horn still had an office there. She didn't even glance at the directory. They moved out over a year ago. I asked if she knew where they had gone. She didn't, or claimed she didn't. I left with my hands in my pockets and my heart sinking lower than it had in weeks. Back home, I dug deeper. If my grandfather had been in contact with them, there had to be a trail. Emails, letters, something. I searched his computer, his filing cabinets, the drawers he kept locked and the ones he didn't. Most were filled with old bills, tax records, and notebooks full of gardening notes. But then I found the USB drive. It was taped to the bottom of a drawer, hidden behind a row of envelopes. I almost missed it. I plugged it in. There were only two folders, one labeled Devlin and the other labeled private. My throat went dry. I clicked on Devlin first. Letters, PDFs, scans of contracts, all with the same branding. Devlin and Horn. Legal templates, correspondence, updates about the supposed inheritance. Some of them dated back 5 years. My grandfather had been chasing this inheritance for years. He had believed it. Just like I had, I opened the private folder next. There was only one file, a text document. It was a journal entry. I read it once, then again, then a third time, and with every line, something inside me shifted. He had known, not everything, but enough. He suspected the inheritance was fake. He had written about his doubts, about the inconsistencies, about the way they asked for small payments over time, about how they avoided direct answers. But he had been too proud to admit he might have been fooled, too afraid of what it would mean, and worst of all, he had written about me. He had hoped that if it was real, I would benefit from it, that maybe, if he kept it going, I would have something after he was gone. He didn't want to leave me with nothing. His words were a mixture of guilt and love and desperation. I sat there long after the screen went dark, my reflection staring back at me from the black glass. He had been scammed, and now, so had I, but I wasn't going to let it end there. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I hadn't known in weeks. It wasn't hope. It wasn't even clarity. It was something colder, sharper, like the edge of a blade pressing lightly against skin. I couldn't name it then, but I would. Later, it was focus. I didn't make coffee. I didn't shower. I didn't check my phone. I went straight to the study, turned on my grandfather's computer, and opened the folder again. I started reading through the files, one by one, as if somewhere inside them was a code I had missed. There were names, addresses, references to legal offices and trust managers. All fake, I assumed, but fake things still had to come from somewhere. Someone had created them. I made a list of every name mentioned in the emails, every sender, every firm, every supposed executor or notary. There were dozens, but many appeared more than once. I cross-referenced them, created a map on paper, lines connecting one document to another, dates stacked on top of names. Patterns began to emerge. Some domains were used repeatedly. Some formatting choices echoed across different letters. Certain phrases appeared again and again. That's when I realized this wasn't just one man pretending to be someone else. It was a system. The lies weren't random. They had form, style, repetition. Whoever had done this had done it before, probably many times, and probably to more people than just us. I remembered the woman at the bank handing me that pamphlet. Financial fraud. It hadn't meant anything. To me at the time, it was just a formality, a gesture, but now I dug it out from the pile on my desk and began to read it properly. It listed common scams. Inheritance fraud was on the first page. The structure was eerily familiar. A distant benefactor, a dormant trust, a sudden contact, legitimizing paperwork, requests for verification, then silence, everything fit, but knowing. The pattern didn't help me find the person behind it. So I turned to the only thing I could still rely on, myself. I started by tracing the email addresses from the documents. I used every tool I could find: reverse lookup sites, Hoy's databases, DNS trails. Most of them were hosted through obscure providers in offshore locations. Others were masked entirely, but one wasn't. One had been registered through a domain provider in Nevada, a small company. Unremarkable. I sent them a request, pretending to be a potential client interested in using their services. I wanted to understand how easy it was to register a fake legal domain through them. The answer was very.noid check. No verification, just a prepaid card and a name. Still, I kept digging. One of the PDFs had metadata. It listed the creator as Ardevlin. It seemed too obvious to be real, but maybe that was the point. I searched the initials everywhere I could: forums, public databases, court filings. At first, nothing came up. Then I got a hit on a forum dedicated to scam victims. A woman in Arizona had posted 2 years ago about a man named Alan R. Devlin who had promised her access to a family trust tied to her late aunt. The amount was similar. The language was nearly identical. She had also received a courier package, signed documents, followed up, and heard nothing. I reached out to her through the forum. I didn't expect an answer. She replied that evening she had been too embarrassed to go to the police. The money she lost had been enough to sting but not destroy. A few thousand. She had chalked it up to her own stupidity and tried to move on, but she still had all the documents. She sent them to me. They matched mine almost word for word, different names, different beneficiaries, different locations. But the structure was the same: fonts, headings, file naming. I asked if she had ever found out who he was. She hadn't, but she remembered one thing: the man she spoke to had a slight accent. American, but not fully. Something off, she thought. He might have spent time abroad. Said he used unusual phrases, slightly formal, as if he was reading from a script. That detail lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. I began searching for any legal actions involving the name Devlin in fraud cases. There were too many. Devlin was a common name, but most of them weren't related. Some were old criminal cases, some were completely unrelated. Then I came across a closed case file in New York. A man named Arthur Devlin had been arrested for wire fraud in 2004. He had impersonated an investment advisor, promising high returns through private equity portfolios. He had been sentenced to 6 years and was released in 2010. The details were sparse. No photo, no follow-up, just the record. I checked the address listed in the file. It was long gone, replaced by a laundromat and a vape shop, but I felt something stir inside me. If that had been him, he had experience, and maybe he had started again. I kept searching. Days blurred. I stopped answering calls, stopped responding to the few emails I still received. My world shrank to the desk, the walls, the screen. I ate only when I couldn't ignore the hunger anymore. Slept when my head dropped forward and my neck ached too much to keep going. Then, on the 5th night, I found something, a LinkedIn profile. The name was different, William Dehart, but the photo caught my attention. It was low resolution, probably taken on an old phone, but something about the eyes felt familiar. Sharp, cold, confident. The profile listed experience at a defunct legal firm in Chicago. Devlin and Horn. I clicked through to the company website. It redirected to a blank page, but the archive still existed. A snapshot from 6 years ago. The contact number on the page was the same one I had tried calling weeks earlier. It was him. I Didn't know how I knew, but I did. William Dehart, Arthur Devlin, a chameleon, and I was going to find him. I took a deep breath, my heartbeat slowed, the fear didn't vanish. It just stopped being important. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was about the wound he had left behind, and I wanted him to feel it, every inch of it. I booked the bus ticket under a name that wasn't mine. It wasn't paranoia. Not yet. Just instinct. The kind that rises when you've been burned and you no longer trust your own shadow. The name I chose was simple, forgettable. I paid in cash, wore a hooded sweatshirt and no makeup. Didn't bring anything that might draw attention. Just a small duffel bag with a change of clothes, my laptop, the printed documents, and the USB drive. The ride to Chicago took 12 hours. I barely slept. My seatmate snored, slumped against the window, oblivious to the storm building beside him. I watched the landscape flatten and blur until the city rose from the horizon like a gray wave. I hadn't been there in years, not since college, and back then, I hadn't imagined I'd return like this, tracking a ghost in business attire, hoping he was arrogant enough to leave a crack open somewhere. The old address of Devlin and Horn was still listed in public databases. A suite in a downtown office tower. It had been vacant for years, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. I walked the streets slowly, memorizing storefronts, counting security cameras. The building hadn't changed. The plaque with the firm's name had been removed, but there were faint screw marks in the marble where it had once hung. I asked the doorman if the suite was available. He said it had been unoccupied since 2018. I asked if he remembered who had leased it before. He didn't, or claimed he didn't, but he looked nervous. The kind of nervous that comes from half-remembered stories you don't want to be responsible for repeating. I thanked him and left without pushing. I'd come back later, maybe with a different approach. I checked into a cheap motel near the edge of the city, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and didn't offer much more than a bed and a bolted door. I spent the evening going through every file again, this time with a red pen. I circled names, annotated phrases, highlighted timestamps and headers. My mind wasn't spinning anymore. It was sharpening. Every piece of information felt like a breadcrumb, and I was starving. The next day, I visited the Public Records Office. I requested archived business licenses under the name Devlin and Horn. There were 3 matches. One dissolved in 2015, another expired in 2019. The third, surprisingly, was still listed as active, though no activity had been logged since 2020. The registered agent listed for the active one was a shell company in Delaware. I copied everything. I then asked for any civil complaints filed under either of the Devlin names, Arthur or William. It took hours, but I eventually found a sealed case from 2012 involving suspected financial misconduct. The plaintiff had withdrawn. No further documentation was available. Another dead end, but it confirmed the pattern. He operated under time-limited fronts. Open a firm, run the scam, let it rot, repeat. That night, I walked the city without direction, just letting the noise settle into my skin again. The cold wind bit at my face, and the streets felt endless. I passed lawyers getting in too, cabs, interns holding coffee, doormen with eyes like tired ghosts. None of them knew the man I was chasing, or maybe they did and had learned not to admit it. Back in the motel, I stared at the wall for hours. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was wired, addicted to the hunt. I realized then that I didn't want justice in the way people usually meant it. I didn't want him to just disappear or be arrested by strangers. I wanted him to see me, to realize I had gotten this far, that I had crawled out of the hole he left me in, that I had followed every trace of him like scent in the air, and I wanted him to know what it felt like to be watched. I began cataloging all known associates tied to the fake firms. Most were just front names, but 2 popped up repeatedly. A notary named Jeffrey Harn and a logistics contact listed as Marcus Bell. I searched both. At first, nothing real came up. But then I found a business license issued to a Marcus Bell for a private courier service in the suburbs of Chicago. The license had expired last year. I rented a car using a prepaid card and drove out there. The address led to a warehouse. Closed. Graffiti on the shutters. I parked down the street and waited. An hour passed. Then two. Just as I was about to give up, a van pulled into the back lot. No logo, just plain white. A man stepped out and used a key to enter the warehouse. I took pictures from the car. Zoomed in. His face was grainy, but I'd seen it before, not directly, but in the profile images buried deep in old company registrations. He was older now, thinner, but it was him. I didn't approach. Not yet. I followed the van. When it left. It went to another building, a smaller office tucked between two larger ones. No sign on the door. No listed business. I waited again, watched people come and go. Every minute made my blood colder. I didn't know if Devlin himself was inside, but I felt it. Like a pulse behind a wall, I went back to the motel and began compiling everything. All the connections, the names, the photos, the addresses. I started a file labeled Phase 1. It was the first time I used the word phase, as if this had become a project, a mission, something more than survival, because it was. This man didn't just steal money, he stole belief, confidence, time, dignity, and I wasn't going to let him do it again. Not to me, not to anyone. I changed motels. The new one was closer to the office. I had found the one without a name, without a trace, hidden in plain sight. I checked in under a different alias, paid in cash, and refused housekeeping. I placed tape over the door seams, so I would know if anyone entered. Every lock was double-checked before I lay down, fully clothed, eyes wide open until morning. Survival had become strategy. Every hour of sleep felt like a negotiation with fear. Each morning, I drove the same route, parked across the street, waited, watched. The man from the van, Marcus Bell, arrived most days around 8:30. Others filtered in between 9 and 10. No one ever stayed past 6. The pattern never broke. On the 5th morning, I saw him. He stepped out of a black sedan, wearing a gray suit, tailored, subtle. No tie, just enough polish to suggest importance without arrogance. His gait was precise, casual, confident, not in a loud way but in the way of someone who expected the world to bend quietly around him. I didn't need confirmation. I knew Arthur R. Devlin, or William Dehart, or whatever name he was using now. He passed within 20 feet of my car and didn't glance once in my direction. His face was exactly as I imagined it: clean lines, slightly hollow cheeks, sharp eyes, a kind of practiced stillness. It wasn't beauty, it was control, perfectly measured, every movement choreographed. He disappeared inside the building. I waited for my heartbeat to slow. It didn't. I watched him leave 6 hours later. He didn't take the sedan. He walked down the street, turned the corner, vanished into the maze of the city. I followed. It first from a distance, then closer. He stopped at a cafe, sat at a corner table, back to the wall, facing the door, ordered something, pulled out a phone. Nothing unusual, but I kept watching. Every move he made seemed rehearsed, a man playing a part he had written himself. I took note of everything: how he sipped his coffee, how he scanned the room, how he smiled at the waitress, polite but empty. It hit me then. What made him so dangerous? He wasn't just a liar, he was hollow. There was no joy, no tension, no flicker of guilt. Just function, just the mask. He left after 30 minutes, walked another 8 blocks, entered a building that looked residential, but the buzzer system was too new, too advanced. I watched him press a code without hesitation. The door clicked open. He disappeared inside. I waited. After 20 minutes, he re-emerged in different clothes. No suit, no briefcase, just jeans, a dark jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low. He blended in perfectly. I followed again. He entered a bar near the river, sleek, dimly lit, a place for expensive silence. I waited outside. knowing I couldn't follow without risk. Instead, I photographed every car nearby, noted license plates, timestamps, traffic patterns. If he was meeting someone, they'd leave traces. They always did. Back in the motel, I began piecing together his routine. Office, caf, apartment, bar, office again. It repeated almost exactly for 3 days. I mapped it hour by hour. He was consistent, meticulous, the type who didn't believe he could be touched. That would be his weakness. People like him didn't plan for someone like me, someone with nothing left to lose. I started making calls to the tip lines listed on the fraud pamphlet I'd received. I gave them partial details, names, dates, locations. I kept my own identity hidden. I wasn't ready to hand over the story. Not yet. I needed more. I began researching every employee who entered that building. One woman stood out, Claire Easton. She appeared in 3 old trust documents from my grandfather's files. Her signature was on them, as a witness or notary. I found her LinkedIn. Paralegal, worked for multiple firms, all of which no longer existed. No photos, no updates into years. I called one of the firms she had previously worked for under a different name, pretending to be someone asking for estate guidance. The receptionist told me the company had dissolved, but she remembered Claire, said she had been sharp, quiet, loyal to her last boss, a man named William Dehart. It was all lining up. Every name I had found in the files had some real-world anchor, a ghost of legitimacy, a smudge of reality. That's how they had built the lie, not from scratch, but from fragments. Real people, real paper, real ink, stitched together like a patchwork designed to trap. And now I was inside the same net, but not caught, not anymore. That night, I walked past the bar where Devlin had disappeared. I stood across the street and watched him through the window. He was laughing, reclining, telling a story to men in tailored coats. I imagined the sound of his voice, smooth, unquestionable, empty. I wondered how many people he had done this to, how many lives he had walked through, smiling as he took everything, and how many of them had let him, because the truth was, he didn't just scam people, he found what they needed: hope, closure, validation, and offered it back to them, dressed as something official, something deserved. He wasn't just a thief, he was a mirror, and now he was looking into mine. I turned away from the window and walked back to the car. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from something darker. I wanted him to see me, not yet, but soon. I wanted him to feel that flicker of doubt, that moment where the script stutters, the calculation slips, the certainty cracks. I wanted to be the face he remembered when everything else fell apart, and I would be, soon. I needed to get closer. Watching from across the street wasn't enough anymore. I had seen his face, traced his path, memorized his rhythm, but the missing pieces lived inside his circle in the people who shook his hand, nodded at his jokes, followed him into quiet rooms. So I found a way in. The building didn't list tenants, but one of the delivery men, a kid no older than 20, told me he dropped packages twice a week for a consulting group on the 4th floor. I followed him once, watched him buzz in. 15 minutes later, he came out carrying an empty box and a $5 bill. The next morning, I walked into a printing shop a few blocks away and ordered 50 leather folders with gold lettering, Easton Strategy Group, a name I borrowed from the woman in the trust documents. A few hours later, I dressed in neutral tones, tied my hair up, added subtle makeup, and carried the folders in a clean white box. I walked straight into the building, head high, smile ready. I pressed the buzzer for the 4th floor. The door clicked. No questions. I stepped inside. The office was sleek and quiet. Frosted glass, minimalist desks, 2 clean carpets. A receptionist looked up, her expression polite but distracted. I handed her the box, said it was a delivery from ESG, and that the order had been prepaid. She took it without hesitation. I didn't leave immediately. I asked for the restroom, said I had been walking all day. She nodded toward a hallway. As I moved past the glass offices, I glanced sideways. I saw faces, heard muffled typing, recognized two of them from surveillance photos, Marcus Bell and the man from the cafe, whom I had labeled Graybeard. Then, behind a door labeled Executive, I caught a glimpse of him, Devlin. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair. He was leaning over a desk, one hand on his temple, the other flipping through papers. The door was half closed. I couldn't see his eyes, but I didn't need to. His presence alone tightened the air like a storm front. I found the restroom and locked the door. My hands were sweating. I splashed water on my face, took deep breaths. I had just stood 10 feet from the man who dismantled my life, and he had no idea. That night, I returned to the motel and began working on the next step. If I was going to infiltrate his world, I needed more than folders and a fake name. I needed a reason to be there, a function, a position that gave me access, visibility, and most of all, credibility. I built a RSUM operations consultant, 5 years in estate management, specialization in high-value asset transitions, references from dissolved firms' names I knew Devlin had used in the past. I wrote it in the tone they respected, crisp, measured, unemotional. Then I set up an online presence just enough to look legitimate. I uploaded the RSUM to a private hiring board frequented by boutique firms. I flagged it to a few of the recruiters connected to Devlin's network, and I waited. 3 days later, I got a call from a blocked number. A woman's voice asked if I was available for a preliminary interview. I said yes. We met at a wine bar on the north side. She introduced herself as Carla, no last name, no company card. Her suit was expensive, but her voice was tired. She asked about my experience in asset verification, risk analysis, and confidentiality under pressure. I gave her answers rehearsed. A dozen times in the mirror, I told her I had worked with family offices, had signed NDAs for clients who valued discretion above all else, and that I never left a paper trail. I said it like it was a burden, like I missed doing real work. She smiled. 2 days later, I received an email with onboarding instructions, independent consultant, temporary term, high-value transitions. I had made it inside. The following Monday, I walked back into the same building, this time through the main entrance, holding a badge, greeted by the same receptionist with a nod. I was given a workstation, near the back, near Claire Easton's desk. She looked older than her photo, thinner, eyes sharp but weary. She didn't speak much. None of them did. It was a culture of silence. People worked, heads down, minimal chatter. Everything felt rehearsed, but no one questioned me, and no one recognized me. I was a shadow among shadows. I watched Devlin from a distance for a week. He floated between offices, rarely stayed in one place for long. His authority wasn't enforced, it was absorbed. People straightened when he passed. They answered before he asked. He never looked rushed, never raised his voice. He didn't manage the firm, he was the firm, and they all knew it. I began collecting information. Slowly, carefully, I mirrored their systems, memorized their filing protocols, learned the digital architecture of their internal drives. Most files were encrypted, but some weren't. I found invoices from shell companies, transfers from offshore banks, contracts with signatures that looked familiar. Every night, I backed up what I could. Every morning, I returned, smiling, nodding, playing the role. The deeper I went, the colder I felt, but I was past the point of return. Then, one afternoon, Claire Easton stopped by my desk. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You're not like the others," she said. "You asked too little." And then she walked away. The words sat with me all night. She knew, or suspected, but she didn't report me. Not yet. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she hated them as much as I did. Or maybe she was just waiting, just like me. That night, I stared at my reflection in the motel mirror. I didn't recognize my own face. The eyes were sharper, the mouth tighter, the expression unreadable. I had become one of them, but only long enough to end them, one by one, from the inside out. I stopped dreaming, sleep became mechanical. I shut my eyes, and the darkness was clean, quiet, blank. No memories, no voices, no fear. I had spent weeks inside the machine he built, breathing its air, mimicking its rhythm, studying its wires. It no longer felt foreign. It felt fragile. He didn't see me, none of them did, and that was their first mistake. By the third week, I had access to everything that mattered. Claire Easton silent, knowing Claire began leaving folders at my desk she claimed were misplaced. Each one was a thread. Wire transfers with blurred origins, trust amendments with forged timestamps, asset movements that violated regulatory codes. Claire never said a word, never lingered. She simply left the trail, and I followed. I spent every night compiling a dossier. Clean, categorized, cross-referenced. It had everything. The names, the structures, the laundering routes. I created backups, physical and digital. One on an encrypted drive hidden beneath floorboards in my motel. One inside a safety deposit box I opened under my mother's maiden name. It was enough to bury him, but I wasn't ready to let go, not yet. One morning, I entered the office and found an envelope on my chair. My name, or the name I was using, written in careful script. Inside, a handwritten note, Conference Room B, noon, bring nothing. I burned the note in the bathroom sink. At noon, I walked in. He was already there, Arthur Devlin. He stood near the window, one hand in his pocket, the other wrapped around a glass of water. His eyes flicked to mine as I entered, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence felt like an interrogation. I said nothing. He studied me for what felt like minutes. Then he smiled faintly, almost kindly. I don't remember hiring you, he said. I met his gaze. Still silent, he walked around the table, slow and measured. You're sharp, he continued. People like you are rare. They don't stay long. Too much awareness. It breeds doubt. He waited for a reaction. I gave him none. He leaned closer. Who are you? I looked at him then, fully. The man who had rewritten my past, stripped me of my name, my inheritance, my family's legacy. A man who had profited from grief, who had studied trust law like a blueprint for theft, who believed every lie he told because they made him rich. But I still said nothing. His eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize me, and that was the second mistake. He dismissed me with a small shake of his head and left the room. I returned to my desk, calm, precise. I had what I needed. That night, I set everything in motion. The dossiers, all of them, were sent to state regulators, the IRS, the FBI, and a journalist I had vetted for months. I created a timeline, a digital breadcrumb trail that led directly to his hands. I included names of accomplices, photos, invoices, offshore accounts, voice memos I had captured when the office doors were carelessly left ajar. I made it impossible to ignore. Then I walked into the office the next morning and acted like nothing had changed. But everything had. By noon, agents were in the lobby, plain clothes, clean IDs, calm voices. They called his name. He stood slowly, smiled, confused, like he didn't understand. They showed him the warrant, and that's when it happened. That flicker, the moment the mask slipped, the moment certainty cracked. He looked at me then. Just once, really looked. His eyes searched mine, and I saw it, recognition, the pieces sliding together, the old files, the forged trusts, the girl he thought had disappeared. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to deny, but no words came. They cuffed him. He didn't struggle. He just watched me as they led him away, and I didn't look away. I wanted him to see. To understand that the thing he destroyed had come back, not broken, not begging, but patient, precise, unforgiving. I left the office an hour later. No goodbyes, no explanations, just a clean exit. I took the long road out of the city, rented a small house in a quiet town by the coast. I didn't change my name this time. I didn't have to hide anymore. The calls came in slowly. Journalists, lawyers, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. I ignored most of them. Let the noise pass. I wasn't chasing validation. I had already won. The estate was never recovered fully. Too many hands. Too many layers. But enough was salvaged to tell the truth. My grandfather's name was restored in public record. The fraudulent trust was dissolved, and the firm Devlin's empire was dismantled piece by piece. He was charged with 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. The trial made headlines, but I never attended. I didn't need to see him in a courtroom. I had already seen the moment that mattered, the moment the mirror shattered, and now, on quiet mornings, I sit by the water, coffee in hand, wind on my face, and I let the silence fill me, not the silence of fear, not the silence of grief, but peace earned, built from fire, and carved into bone. I am not who I was, but I am not his shadow either. I am what's left when everything false burns away, and that will always be enough. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video for more scam and revenge stories.